I love horror games. Survival horror, first person, psychological horror, jump scares, stealth focused horror, puzzle centric horror. Hell, horror games have almost as many subgenres as jazz music these days. In my heart of hearts, I grew up on survival horror, from Silent Hill to even games like Zombies Ate My Neighbors. However, one game did start that love, and that was Resident Evil. I came up on gaming mostly during the N64 era, so oddly enough, Resident Evil 2 was my first introduction, equipped with its weird storage constraints and blood effect selections. And it wasn't until my siblings and I got our GameCube and the Resident Evil remake that I realized survival horror was going to be one of my favorite genres of games. And since then, I've played a lot of horror games, and I have noticed a trend over these years. It's not just the survival horror aspect, it's not the tank controls, and I don't think it's even the puzzles. It's the B-horror aesthetic that makes it worthwhile. And by B-horror, for those that don't know, I mean the B as in budget. B-horror doesn't have a concrete set of requirements, but it can be generally described with the following. It's going to have lower budgets, a creative yet unorthodox vision, niche and specific aesthetic, and then a focus on atmosphere. And with the above list, you can probably take the educated guess that a lower budget is usually what drives the following bullet points. Now, I can admit, a game series like Resident Evil doesn't really have budget constraints in comparison to the plethora of horror games out there. But it did start with some form of limitations. And if you're curious about it, there are dozens of YouTubers who talk about the early trilogy of Resident Evil, or you can even read this book, like Itchy Tasty. This is one of those books like I'm a proud Kickstarter backer of, so I'm gonna put it out there. True fan energy. But I am not here to talk about Resident Evil. I'm actually here to talk about this game, Tormented Souls, a game released back in 2021, a game I said I would play back in 2021, and a game that actually recently announced that they're releasing a sequel this year, October 2025. And with that announcement, the game is currently, as of writing this video in September of 2025, heavily discounted down to $1.99 US. And I realized I had no excuse to not play this game. And oh my god, was this game absolutely frustrating, tedious, confusing, janky, and honestly poorly written. And I loved every goddamn second of it. Tormented Souls embodied all of the original budget horror energy and spirit of those days when I used to spend hours playing early Resident Evil games. So I wanted to talk about how this game's B-horror issues actually led me to fall in love with it. I will spoil bits and pieces of the story, and there will be visual spoilers as I use the footage of the game with my own playthrough, but I won't be relaying to you every bit of story in the game. To kickstart Tormented Souls, it forces an interesting tutorial moment as soon as you begin the game. There's this little to no preamble, and you are immediately met to learn the exploration/interaction of item sequence, as you get a letter about missing twins and that it gives you a headache. From there, our main character decides that they need to travel to a remote part of Canada to investigate where this letter came from. Personally, I would have just taken some ibuprofen and called it a day, but yeah, trekking it, across the country to learn more about a strange letter seems like the right thing to do. So, that's my first point. The story of Tormented Soul, from its get-go, is filled with, why would you do that? And it doesn't stop there. It's predictable, it's ominous, the foreshadowing is as subtle as a hammer to the back of the head, and for some reason, radiation is just a driving force for part of the story, but it has no impact on our main character whatsoever. It feels like the writers here were given the mansion that the game takes place in and the monster designs, and then they were just told, work back from here. I mean, not to spoil anything directly, but at one point the game starts diving into time travel, as a way to drive the story and arguably some very clever puzzles. I mean, it's no Primer, that movie from like 2004 in terms of time travel theory, but it's there. And with some storytelling elitism just not, directing you, it makes sense enough for you to continue wanting to see how this is all going to play out. Now, outside of the story, the game oozes with callbacks and passion built from the original late 90s to early 2000s survival horror games. Tank controls, fixed camera angles, a poorly optimized quick turn button combination, and an inventory system that lets you reload so you don't have to waste precious seconds doing the animation when you're being attacked. Not that any of that will matter too much anyway, because every time you think you're going to get a shot off with a monster close by, they will hit you anyway. But don't worry, the developers usually have snuck a healing item either before or after a monster encounter to make sure you don't die too quickly. Oh, also the healing item in this game goes from morphine to a first aid kit, so I'm glad to know that our hero Caroline here will have an addiction that she will need to deal with post-story. I will say though, the combat and its encounters really did make me feel like it was 20 plus years ago. I was learning animations, death sounds, and even utilized my survival horror knowledge base. It's totally worth being attacked again to save some precious nail gun ammo by smacking these things with a crowbar after they've fallen over. Or just trying to run away and around the monsters where I could. Also, side note, the weapons in this game are both clever and absolutely ridiculous. For example, nail gun? Clever. Why would there be a handgun in a mansion transformed into a hospital? But yeah, I guess we can also make a shotgun out of some old pipes. Oh yeah, and then why wouldn't there be a giant electrical poker weapon that lets you send a couple hundred volts into your enemy by stabbing them and pressing a trigger? However, all these little things, from the monster's attack animations being a bit unfair or the movements being slow and the weapons being utterly ridiculous, it makes it all so memorable. As I was playing Tormented Souls, I was at times giggling to myself, but it was like a childish laugh. I was having fun. I was interested to see what wacky setup or room or spooky environment the developers had in store for me next. The old-timey hospital, mixed with a very inspired Resident Evil mansion, led to just a beautiful and terrifying backdrop. The monsters varied in their gore and disgust, and the animation between their designs had a range from absolutely bone-chilling to somewhat comical. But I couldn't pull away from it. I even have the perfect example of this. Within the story of Tormented Souls, you will encounter this monster. It ends up being important to the story, but it's also not explained at all because this particular monster could be one or two people. But here's the thing. This monster/ghost is the Nemesis callback from Resident Evil 3. It will appear in random rooms, especially as you progress puzzles. It is unkillable and will cause the only quick time event in the game if it grabs you. However, you can literally despawn it by exiting and re-entering the room, which to me is just so janky and silly coding. But I only figured it out after wasting multiple shotgun rounds, one medical pack, and about 2 to 3 shock stick charges. And if that isn't peak survival horror gameplay, I don't know what is. And that leads me over to my next topic. This game's puzzles are not only the most ridiculous and frustrating things I've ever encountered, but when you bang your head against the wall for 30 minutes and then eventually look up some sort of hint or guide, sometimes it still doesn't even make sense. My biggest example is this combination key, which actually was the bane of my existence. Or now this timing puzzle had a latency when using a mouse, so it took me 50 tries until I got the timing right. Now, I should say, this is a huge shortcoming by the developers. I know a lot of us experienced this type of frustration in earlier survival horror games and would revert to looking up these terrible text guides on GameSpot.com, or maybe you had the official Prima strategy guide, or if you were really lucky, someone's older sibling would help you out. But the hints to the puzzles in those games actually were in the game. Maybe it was hidden in some journal or a description in the painting. But maybe I'm just as intelligent as I was in middle school, but a lot of the puzzles in Tormented Souls were not explained. And if they were, you were off by like one rotation. Looking at you in this particular clock puzzle. But in that same breath, though, I really enjoyed how wild and frustrating some of these puzzles got. I always give puzzles within games 2 tries past a frustration level. After that, I usually revert to a hint to see if I'm at least on the right path, and if that doesn't work, then I'll go look at the guide. And honestly, some of these puzzles are damn clever. I mean, there's this one puzzle that involves infinite doors, and it's pivotal to getting the good ending of the game, but honestly, it felt like it was straight out of a Dungeons and Dragons puzzle with a very, very angry dungeon master at its helm. So, all in all, there I was, playing Tormented Souls, a game littered with these budget horror elements and just so many callbacks to my childhood gaming that I wondered what year it was for a moment. And all I could think of was, man, B horror is the real way to make a horror game. If it doesn't have the jank, if it doesn't have the bad voice acting, also bonus points for this Canadian pronunciation.
What? I'm sorry.
And a borderline hard to follow story, and of course enough jump scares to make my heart rate increase, I don't think it's ever going to be truly survival horror. So you may be wondering and asking yourself the question, should you play Tormented Souls? And I think that answer is a solid yes. If you're a fan of the late 90s and early 2000s survival horror era, and you're looking to be lost again, feeling like that kid sneaking downstairs to play a scary game in the dark, this game will have you feeling that rush again, and maybe you'll be ready for its sequel in October. Hell, maybe this will be the first new release game that I play when it's released in 2 years. So, with that being said, this is a nice short little dive into a horror game that really blew me away recently. I'm curious if you've played it. I'm curious if there's other games out there that you enjoy and that I should maybe add to my long list of games that I need to play. But of course, I'm always appreciative of you stopping by and listening to me ramble on about something. So I've been Matthew.E. Thank you so much.